Greetings, this is B. Kyle from the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce. And as we continue to navigate this new normal in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're doing our best to get resources into the hands of our businesses, our solopreneurs, and our nonprofits. And in that spirit, today we're recording a series of 3 webinars targeting these business types. And we are so grateful for the expertise represented by SPAC member Baker Tilly, a leading advisory, tax, and assurance firm dedicated to building long-lasting relationships and helping clients anticipate tomorrow. That's especially relevant now, I'd say. I'd like to introduce our panelists, Adam Gehring and Larry Moore. Both are partners in Baker Tilly's tax division. Adam and Larry, welcome.
Oh, hi, B. Glad to be here.
Thank you, both of you.
Yes, thank you very much.
So given that so much is changing so quickly, we didn't want to delay the recording of these webinars. Should you watch, should you listen to this and have questions, know that Baker Tilly team looks forward to collecting questions, publishing them in the form of an FAQ list that we will make available to all who want it. Today's focus is the nonprofits and resources available to you. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Adam and Larry, if you would set the stage for the economic stimulus package overall.
Sure. So just, looking back, tomorrow, it will be 2 weeks since the president signed the, what's widely known as the CARES Act into law. It has been a whirlwind for, both for-profit and not-for-profit businesses and trying to digest all of the potential benefits made available, under this, unprecedented CARES Act. So Larry and I have spent the last 2 weeks really diving deeply into, the components of that. First and foremost is the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP or Triple P, however you prefer to refer that has gotten so much attention, and rightfully so, from, the public, from businesses, and what it is doing and will be doing to, help support those businesses which are in dire need of, funds to continue on. There's some other benefits or items created in that CARES Act, such as the employee retention credit, the payroll tax deferral, and other, sick leave credits that are going to be available to employers. So lots for businesses, whether they are for-profit or not-for-profit, to sit down with their advisors, talk about to make sure that they're obtaining the best and, most favorable benefits under this unprecedented act.
I appreciate that introduction. The format, for those of you listening today, is really a Q&A. I have a series of what I consider to be FAQs. Folks have been asking me these things quite regularly, or as I read and hear reports from, here are questions that come up regularly. So the assumption is the general concept of these programs is understood, and we're going to dive into the uniquenesses or questions that are coming up from our members. So if I can, gentlemen, the first question is, in terms of the Paycheck Protection Program, do you have a sense of how quickly these loans are turning? And if a nonprofit is in crisis right now, is this still the best option?
Larry, this is Adam. I can take that one if that's all right.
Sounds good.
So B, as I noted in my introduction, we're only 2 weeks into the existence of the PPP, and we're approaching the 1 week mark of, applications actually being available. So for those businesses that were on the forefront or the front end of the application process with their lenders, we're hearing that those funds are arriving within businesses, and so that is inside of a week. Really, it's then, available for people as long as they can, get in touch with their lenders, understand the lender's process, will be indicative or dictate, how fast that cash could potentially be available for those not-for-profits in crisis. But, based on the overarching, parameters of the PPP, its lack of a guarantee, its, forgiveness feature, I would say that yes, that is still the best option, for companies or not-for-profits to, pursue as, option number one at this point.
Excellent, thank you. Continuing on the questions about the Paycheck Protection Program, I do know that guidance continues to be updated. What I have found to be still in question relative to consistent guidance has to do with the eligibility based on employee count. I know it's 500 employees or fewer, or there is this SBA size standards. Can you explain that and tell us how that applies?
Yeah, this is Larry. I think I will jump in on this one. I think the place to start with the Paycheck Protection Program is, since this program is geared towards not-for-profits, to let everyone know that when the law says not-for-profit, in this particular case, it is only those organizations that are tax exempt under 501c3 and 501c19. So unfortunately, those of you that are not tax exempt under these provisions, this program does not apply to you. But to answer the question, yeah, initially everyone was thinking that it was, if you had more than 500 employees, you weren't able to avail yourself of this program. But that's not exactly true. There's been quite a bit of Q&A that's come out of Treasury that has talked through this. So you can have a situation where you have more than 500 employees if you qualify for what's known as a small business concern under the SBA Act. And basically what you do is you have to go to the SBA website to look at your NAICS code to see the industry code that your organization is under in order to determine whether you might fit under one of the revenue size examples in that section. So the place to go is www.sba.gov/size. You can go in there, take a look at what your particular NAICS code is to determine what the revenue standard is for you in particular. Now, there's a second component to this as well, which is called the alternative size standard. And the alternative size standard is applicable as of March 27th, 2020. And what it does is it looks at two different components. And these are ands. You have to meet both of these. One is your tangible net worth is less than or equal to $15 million, and your average net income after federal income tax for 2 full fiscal years, your average over 2 full fiscal years is less than the $5 million. Adam, did I say that right? Is it 5 or 5.5?
Oh, sorry, Larry. You just had broke up in my headset there a moment.
Oh, did I say that right on the size? Is it 5 million or 5.5?
For the
anyway, well,
yeah, for the alternate
the
size
net
standard,
income.
it is 5 million. Excuse me. Yes.
5 million. So I did get that right. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Now, the key here is, since we're addressing mostly not-for-profit organizations, the first thing you're going to say is, well, those are really taxable entity parameters, and we know this. Right now, we don't have any guidance with respect to that. We're hoping that some additional guidance comes out. As we mentioned earlier in the session, this is all in flex, so we'll see what comes out with respect to that. In the meantime, you'll just have to take a look at those definitions and see how they apply to you. The one I do know is when the second part of the test talks about net income after federal income tax, the provisions do allow for you, if you don't have a federal income tax, that you can apply the federal rate to come up to your number.
Great.
So lots more hopefully coming out on that one.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question lots of folks have has to do with, well, so first of all, the PPP is intended to assist organizations keeping their employees on the payroll, and it's based, you get a certain amount of potentially in advance based on how many employees you have. But there's this question about a cap of $100,000 per employee as a compensation limit. And I need some help interpreting what that means. What's included in that? And does that mean we can recognize up to $100,000, or that means we don't count that employee altogether if he or she makes more than $100,000?
Sure. Definitely hot topic over the last 2 weeks. Thankfully, there is some very clear guidance that the SBA and Treasury issued in the form of their frequently asked question form. So if anybody is looking directly for those, they can visit home.treasury.gov/cares, and the most up-to-date frequently asked questions will be posted to that site. But I can, comment on your question, B. It is not a disqualifying factor to have an employee that earns over $100,000. Just the payroll costs that you would use for them in the, how much can I borrow computation is capped at $100,000. The frequently asked question, and for those that maybe are already at that website, that is frequently asked question number 7, really helps give guidance and clarity that this $100,000 cap only applies to, in essence, cash compensation. And you are then able to, on top of that, add in, any employer defined benefits that are paid and some other items. So great clarity that we got in the last handful of days, within these frequently asked questions to answer that question.
Excellent, thank you. Also, as part of in the decision tree, I'm in crisis. I want to explore my options. PPP is one of them. One of the requirements is, has your organization been negatively impacted by COVID-19? What kind of proof is necessary to demonstrate that? Do you know?
So for a nonprofit organization, what you'll have to look at is there's a certification requirement. And it's basically a good faith certification that there is some uncertainty with respect to the current economic conditions that makes it necessary for the loan request. Pretty broad, right?
Right.
So there's no other test.
Oh, excellent.
And then you have to simply acknowledge that the funds will be used to maintain payroll, retain workers, or mortgage payments, lease payments, and utility payments, those sorts of things. But it's a very broad category with respect to qualification.
Gotcha.
And some of the other programs, B, have more specific, revenue decline tests. So if people are looking at some of the other things, they should, consult their, personal advisors, or even the resources that we've put at our firm at bakertilly.com to help, educate people as to the additional parameters if they are looking at some of these other programs.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Another question that comes up regularly is how to count employees versus 1099 contractors. What's the rule there?
Yeah, so again, a lot more clarity was obtained, in the interim guidance we got, as well as the frequently asked questions. And so for a not-for-profit, really the focus is on its employees and cannot include payments made to independent contractors in the how much can I borrow calculation. The language within the CARES Act and the interim guidance was a little gray initially, and people weren't sure if you could include 1099 payments to contractors in your calculation of payroll costs, but that has since been excluded, and understood that language is in the CARES Act and the interim guidance really to help those individuals who are actually independent contractors.
Well, take a down a rabbit hole here for a second on that one. What I find challenging is that the nonprofits most severely in need of money are the smallest with the fewest number of employees. And if the PPP is based on employee count, you get the least amount of money when you have the greatest amount of need. Has that challenge, I'm totally asking you a blind question here, but
yeah, it's all right.
Challenge come up?
It has. We've worked through again, how much can I borrow computation with many both for-profit and not-for-profit entities, and that does play into it. And yes, there is a disconnect. There are some other loan programs that would be and are available, both at the state level as well as, the federal level, to explore if the, PPP doesn't provide enough, and or sufficient funds to really make a difference. So, but yes, that is an unfortunate, byproduct of the math behind how much can I borrow.
Yeah, and then on the other end of a larger nonprofit, how do you handle, I'm a national nonprofit, but I have small offices, and how do you do that with multiple locations?
Yeah, and so it really boils down to, at what level, or with the first question I would ask in that situation, getting into that detail, is each location in its own separate legal entity? So I think we want to be thinking about the PPP in the context of who will be applying. Would that be, the overarching entity, or would that be, each sub-entity within the location? And so it is really a, not-for-profit by not-for-profit, specific analysis to understand, who would be applying and at what level. So there are some, potential affiliation rules that need to be applied, and it's one of the more complex areas that we've been running into. Larry, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, we did run into that early on, especially with religious organizations. They were concerned that because of the interaction of the different organizations from a religious affiliation perspective, that would be a problem. Thankfully, with the Q&As that came out under the affiliation rules that Adam was referring to, the fact that you are connected because of a religious component does not make it an affiliation, and so you don't have to count all of the employees all the way up the chain, if you will, with respect to religious organizations. But you do still have to look at affiliations that if you are controlled by another organization, even if you're a not-for-profit, you have to be careful and look at what that affiliation is. If it's not a religious affiliation, then you still have to count those employees as part of your employee count.
Towards a revenue cap as well, right?
That's correct.
What is it, $10 million? Did I read that right? Maybe not.
As far as the total amount of money that you can borrow, correct.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So I've also read about one SBA lender might be inconsistently applying the rules such that, well, if my lender denies me, or I think he or she is interpreting the guidance incorrectly, do I have the ability to go to a different SBA lender? Is that okay?
I would say at this point, there's a little uncertainty around that. When you follow through the rules, it does state that, you can only have one loan in place with regards to the PPP. And the question is, if at what point would loan one, terminate its process sufficiently for you to not run afoul of that requirement to only have, one loan or one loan in process. And so, I think if you have an understanding from the lender number one that you would be working with that, yes, your process is terminated, I would believe that it would be okay to work, with a second bank to see what their viewpoint on this is. But again, that is a area that is, not fully clear. Larry, would you have anything to add on that front?
I think you said it all.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So here's an area I really don't understand very well at all. This idea of paid sick leave, and how is that relevant in the context of this Paycheck Protection Program?
Yeah, I think the relevance is that the PPP is intended to cover payroll costs. It's the Paycheck Protection Program. But where sick leave comes into play is if an entity is paying that sick leave, can they use their PPP funds, to cover that cost related to employee? And, that was allowed within the instructions that the SBA and Treasury put out for PPP funds to cover sick leave. But the piece to be aware of is, that if PPP funds are used to cover, sick leave, then you would be taking the ability for that organization to take certain, credits or tax credits related to the payment of that sick leave off the table. So it is a kind of a one or the other proposition here.
Gotcha. Well, okay, that's helpful. Thank you. A question about determining the number of employees and payroll costs. What's the time period that a borrower is supposed to use to determine that maximum loan amount?
Yeah, so this was one of the most confusing and inconsistent areas of application that we encountered, in week one until the frequently asked questions were issued. But since then, it has become very clear with those frequently asked questions, that you can either use the calendar year of 2019 to determine your payroll costs, or you can actually use the 12 months prior to your application. So there is a little flexibility, and that answer to that question is really contained in frequently asked question number 14 within the Treasury and SBA's document.
That's fabulous. Thank you. All right. So here's a question that I get a lot. The small companies, businesses and nonprofits alike already are on the bubble in terms of economic stability as an organization. I don't want to loans. Most of this is a loan structure, with the exception of the potential for a $10,000 up to $10,000 advance, which is another question. People think they're getting $10,000 and they're not. It's a potential, right? But how do I know how much of my PPP loan can be forgiven?
Sure, and I'll just even address your $10,000 advance comment. I believe that $10,000 advance is really tied to and related to one of the other disaster loan products that the SBA has, and that's the EIDL loan program. Right. Nope, and so there's so much information floating out there. I just didn't want people to be thinking there was an advance feature with regards to the PPP. That is related to this emergency economic injury disaster loan, which came into existence, at least with regards to the coronavirus, a week before the PPP, and this is what everybody was looking at prior to the PPP. So, and
Adam, can I jump in on that?
Please,
Larry.
You
brought that up initially. Yep. Just so the group knows, as not-for-profits, all not-for-profits that are exempt under 501c can use the loan program that Adam just mentioned, the EIDL, which is different than the PPP program. As we mentioned earlier, the PPP program only covers 501c3s and 501c19s. The other program that the SBA puts out does cover all nonprofits.
That's a very important point of clarification. Thank you. I wasn't sure about that for organization mine. Thanks.
So I can finish up answering the question, getting back to the PPP and its loan forgiveness feature. The question that we always are asking right now is how much can I borrow? And that is 2.5 times, the average monthly salary. But then the question now is, after you receive the funds, how much can be forgiven? And the same payroll costs that were used to calculate the how much can I borrow are then used to determine how much am I forgiven. So there are a handful of different tests that need to be met, in order to get the loan forgiven. But as long as a substantial portion, and there's still some clarity needed around this, but as long as use a 75% benchmark of the loan is used to cover payroll in the 8 weeks after the loan is received, that amount will likely be forgiven. Additionally, there is a provision where rent costs, utility costs, potentially interest on previous debt obligations might also be qualified expenses that would allow for forgiveness. So there does have to be a certain amount of spend within the 8 weeks after the PPP funds are obtained. Also, there's a requirement, there are a couple more requirements for each organization to maintain their head count. It can't be a situation where head count decreases substantially, and there are a couple base periods that can be applied to this. And then the payroll cannot be on its face reduced greater than 25% to employees making $100,000 a year. So it is a fairly lengthy analysis that companies who have received those funds are going through. That is something that Baker Tilly's created actually a calculator to help our clients, and work through. And if people are interested in that, they can visit bakertilly.com, navigate to our coronavirus website, and within that coronavirus resource website, there is a place to request assistance with the, I'll call it loan calculator and loan forgiveness calculator.
That's great. Thank you.
There are just a lot of hurdles that people need to be aware of, and should really be working with somebody who's worked through this, in the last 2 weeks.
How does this loan affect my 2020 tax filing?
The nice thing with the PPP loan is that, as we talked about, it's forgivable. And then what some people get concerned about is, oh, if I have debt forgiveness, then is that taxable income to me that I have to pay taxes on? The federal government thought about that in passing this legislation. And so the debt forgiveness is not subject to income tax. A lot of the not-for-profits that are out there listening to this going, well, we don't pay income tax anyway, which is correct. So it also, just to alleviate any concerns, would not be considered unrelated business income that you might have to pay tax on. So you're okay there as well. The only caveat I put on that is to track what state you're in and see what the states are doing with respect to the debt forgiveness part. We're tracking that on a day-to-day basis to see what the states are doing, but take that into consideration that there could be some income tax component there.
Okay. So we mentioned briefly the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program through the SBA and the Treasury, and I know those two are connected somehow. Can you explain a little bit about how applying for one might impact the other?
Yep, definitely. I think, the receipt of funds from both a PPP and an EIDL is something that is allowed. However, if that is the case, I would definitely recommend, working with an advisor to make sure not-for-profits out there are staying within the, confines of the rules. Simply put, any PPP, loan funds cannot be used for the same purpose as you use your EIDL funds. So I think it's simply keeping in mind that the PPP, based on its definition, really needs to be used for and to cover payroll costs and some other limited costs. And if somebody's receiving both programs, they then shouldn't use EIDL funds to cover payroll costs. So there does need to be cognizance and an analysis as to what each of the funds are used for if an organization out there ends up receiving both a PPP loan as well as an EIDL loan.
Excellent. Thank you. That's helpful. And then help me understand as well. You'd mentioned employee retention credit. You mentioned payroll tax deferral. And then we've got a credit or deferral on the tax side of things, or on your 990s. Us who are not-for-profit still have UBIT. So, I mean, the tax component is interesting. How do you balance the retention credit, a payroll tax deferral, versus the upfront loan or advance? Is there an analysis to determine which is a better path to choose?
Yeah, there is. I mean, working through the how much can I borrow estimator, or computation for the PPP is important. That would give you the context of a starting point in my mind of, what loan you could receive, and then presumably a good chunk of that would be forgiven. So that's a very powerful aspect of the PPP. We've then been working with our clients to take that number and compare that against what the total employee retention credit may look like. This is completely back of the napkin, but the max employee retention credit per employee is capped out at $5,000. So simple math would compare the PPP loan amount that you expect to be forgiven versus $5,000 times the head count you have that you think could qualify, and seeing which is a more powerful tool, to pursue. One thing to note that the employee retention credit doesn't have the same 500 employee cap on it. So this is available to larger organizations who may not otherwise be under the qualifying parameters for the PPP. Additionally, there also is the payroll tax deferral, where an organization can take their, employer share of FICA and defer that for the year 2020, for the remainder of 2020 out to December 31st of 2021. And December 31st, of 2022. And there's no employee size limit or cap on that. So those two, employee retention credits and payroll tax deferrals are something that a lot larger organizations or organizations where that is more valuable than the PPP are considering.
Gotcha.
And Adam, isn't the employee retention credit, that's a credit against your FICA taxes, right?
It is, correct, yes.
Okay.
So non-for-profits can take advantage of that as well. You don't have to worry about having to pay any income tax. It's a credit against your FICA taxes.
Your
and
payroll
you would
taxes.
get benefit for that.
Yep.
Payroll taxes, yes.
All right, that's actually good to keep in mind. Thank you for that. All right, so you'd mentioned, Adam, a little bit ago that you can get only one loan. So
Correct, yep.
the question about switching lenders is you got to make sure there's only one active loan. But what if I need to increase the amount I want? Can I go back to my lender and say, expand it, please? Is that an option?
Well, it would really depend at what point the application is in, within the process. So, prior to submission, to the SBA, our understanding is there might be the ability to, modify the how much can I borrow calculation, if, new data was available. But our understanding is once that does go to the SBA, there's unlikely to be an opportunity to, change, modify, increase, or get then a second loan. So some
Okay,
diligence on the front end is extremely important to make sure that that number is, maximized within the rules.
Okay, but let's just say I want to be conservative. You do an analysis of my 501c3 organization, how many staff, what I'm eligible for, and you tell me that you're eligible for a $200,000 PPP loan.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right one, or am I getting myself confused?
Nope, it is 2.5 times the
Okay.
average monthly payroll. Yes.
So let's just say it comes up to, yeah, I'm eligible for 200,000, but I don't want to take that much out. I'm not sure how much of that's going to be forgiven. I'm only going to apply for $100,000. And then this thing continues longer and I realize, oh my gosh, I'm in more trouble than I thought. I'm going to come back to you and say, okay, now I'd like to take it to the max, with as long as I'm not exceeding what you
And I don't know that we know the exact answer to your question, B, but there's just no guidance with regards to your circumstance. Again, what we know is you can only have one loan under the program. So I don't know if tacking on additional funds would be considered a new loan, which therefore would be prohibited.
Okay.
But what I would say is for the organizations out there that are maybe having the same thought that you had, there will be a lot of clarity after 8 weeks of loan receipt. You will understand how much will be forgiven. There is an option for the organization to just repay whatever funds, that are not forgiven right away. Both principal and interest payments are to be deferred for 6 months under the PPP parameters. So, it could be that an organization would, not retain a unforgiven loan component of the PPP by paying those funds back within 6 months. But if an organization did decide to retain those funds, they should also be aware that the loan that they would have to pay back those funds is a 2-year term loan with a 1% interest rate. So, very low cost and favorable borrowing terms. But an organization would have to, understand whether that is, doable and or desirable for them to retain.
Excellent, thank you. Another thing I've been doing some research on is these community and corporate foundations and relief funds. Looking through the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, they have a special edition of their 2020 Minnesota Grants Directory. And I'm going to share this out with folks. So my question of you is, do you have any other resources like that you can recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a variety of other things that are out there. Besides the grant programs that are out there, each day we're seeing different foundations coming out with different areas where they're supporting not-for-profit organizations. The other thing is, if you are a not-for-profit organization and you elected out of the unemployment insurance, and so you're paying directly for any employees that you laid off or furloughed, that part of the CARES Act is providing 50% of that cost to the states. So that'll get covered, which will help for 50% of the cost. A lot of my clients are looking at that and saying, yeah, but I can't afford the other 50%. So keep following up with your state. Here in Minnesota, it's been brought up several times with the legislature. They are still contemplating that. I do not believe at this point in time that they have come out with anything in support of that. Other states have. So for instance, Michigan has come out and said that it will cover the other 50% of that. So keep your eyes open, talk to your folks in the legislature to see, if you're in Minnesota, for instance, start talking to them to tell them that you really need that funding. If you're an organization that's greater than 500 employees and you don't meet any of the other exceptions that we talked about earlier, there is also what's known, I call it the industry stabilization loan. Adam, you've seen it called a couple of different things.
Yep.
That we talked about earlier. But that's for organizations that have more than 500 but less than 10,000 employees. There's a few other parameters around it. And it is true, it's a straight loan, but at least it provides some interim funding for you at a low interest rate. It is currently not forgivable, but that is also an opportunity that is out there and only applies if you don't apply for any of the other programs that are in the CARES Act.
Yeah, so those large organizations, Larry, do have that opportunity, or larger. The term I've seen used in the news as of today, when the Federal Reserve made some announcements, was the Main Street Lending Program. So for those large organizations out there, definitely more to come after today on the Main Street Lending Program.
Okay, thanks. What do you hear about a fourth stimulus package Congress has been discussing? Do you have any updates?
What haven't we heard?
You just heard it's in
a lot of rumors. Yeah, there's a lot of rumors out there. Early on, there was discussion around it being another major stimulus package, and once the Democrats and Republicans sat down and started talking through that, they realized that if they were going to get more money out there early on or sooner, that they would have to do something different. So I do believe there's going to be a larger stimulus package yet to come. But I think number 4 is going to be Congress taking a look at the programs that they passed here with the CARES Act. And so, for instance, if the Paycheck Protection Program works the way they think it's going to work, my guess is they'll start there. It'd just be easy just to provide additional funding for that program if additional funding is needed, which we're hearing that money is going to run out, relatively soon. And then the other programs that are out there, more discussion around, well, do we increase the $1,200 per person and make, double that number and these sorts of things. So there's a lot of talk. You just kind of have to keep your eyes and ears open to see what's coming through. And definitely as it does, we will get that information out through our website or through additional webinars and these sorts of things.
Thank you. And I have just one final question, and it's about my organization and those like mine, 501c6. So I am the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce is a 501c6. We also have a supporting foundation, a 501c3. I've gotten some conflicting guidance on eligibility for the C6 for PPP or EIDL. I do know that the C3, of course, in theory anyway, is eligible for the PPP, and I've got one staff person, right? So that, again, to our point earlier, it doesn't create a significant lift there. But I was on a call with the National Council of Foundations earlier this week, and this gal said that C3s that are called supporting foundations, like mine, dedicated to supporting my organization, are ineligible. So I've got that, and then the U.S. Travel Association flyer in front of me said that 501c3s are, eligible. So I've got number 1, how does a supporting foundation qualify and does it? And number 2, a C6. You told me we should look at the PPP. You said the PPP is for all Cs, right? No, you said the EIDL is for all Cs. So I should be looking at that. This PPP for the foundation, EIDL for a C6, which is new information for me. And then this definition of supporting foundations. Is that just about lack of clarity with guidance? What do you think?
Yeah, it's easy to answer the C6 question. The law is very clear with the Paycheck Protection Program that is only available for 501c3 organizations, but the EIDL program is open to all entities that are tax exempt under 501c. So a 501c6 would be an entity exempt, so that would apply. There are some restrictions, and there's been a lot of back and forth on the supporting organization issue. And is your particular foundation a supporting organization, or is it tax exempt on its own? Is it?
It's got its own 501c3 tax exempt status. But I am the.
But it's not class. But is it classified as a supporting organization, or is it a public charity under one of the other provisions?
Oh, so that's the clarifying question. How is it structured? I can't say.
Yes, exactly.
Gotcha.
So that's what you'd have to look at specific to the foundations.
Because, all right. Well, so those were our questions. And thank you very much for taking all the time to go over this with me. Are there any other FAQs that you've seen come up a lot that we missed that you want to bring up for us?
From my standpoint, this was a all-inclusive discussion and had hit on most of the, I'll call them, pain points that people were going through in the first 2 weeks of this program's existence. So,
well, thank you.
I would agree.
So this, again, Adam Gehring and Larry Moore of Baker Tilly. Thank you, gentlemen, both for taking the time with me. These two folks will be joining me for 2 more sessions, one on small business and then one on the independent contractor / solopreneur, as it were. So thank you again, gentlemen. And finally, I want to refer listeners to the SPAC events page. What we're posting on our events page are all of the webinars, all of the research and information that we're getting from the community, particularly experts like Baker Tilly. When they provide and publish webinars, we're posting links to them on our events page, so you can find a resource for these kinds of conversation and this level of expertise that frankly no one else can provide. And also our website has links to all these resources, as does Ramsey County's website, which is www.ramseycountymeansbusiness.org, where you also can get access to our rapid response team. If the information you get on the web is still so difficult to process and you need some one-on-one conversations, our rapid response team is there to help you find your way through. So again, gentlemen, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and good luck to everybody.
Yes, indeed. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.